Okay, everyone, I'd like to welcome you to both our class, but at the same time today will be the ecosystem restoration seminar. And I'm hoping that everyone can hear me and hopefully also online can hear the presentation today. I'd like to introduce everybody to Scott Schell, who's at UW as our Extension Entomology Specialist. And I've known him for several years and he's done some fantastic work here. And like we've talked a little bit about in class, when it comes to insects, it looks like based on current research, they're declining about 40% worldwide. So it's pretty amazing stuff. And Scott's going to talk to us today about pollinator insects playing an important role in sustaining diversified habitats.
Well, thank you, Christina. And you started the recording?
Yes,
Yep,
I did.
I see it. Okay. I just wanted to make sure everybody was able to get to see it later on if they need to. As Christina said, I'm an extension entomologist, and since I'm the only one in Wyoming, I'm kind of a jack of all trades as far as needing to cover a lot of things in broader detail. But I was asked to present on the role that insects, specifically the insects that pollinate plants, what role can they play in sustaining diversified habitats that you try to do when you restore disturbed lands. Let's see here if I can get it to go. There we go. And they aren't all honeybees and butterflies. A lot of times people might have that thought that it's only honeybees and butterflies that visit plants and are pollinators. And actually, of course, honeybees are an introduced species from Europe, and all of our flowering plants that required insect pollination in North America had native pollinators. And there are many types, such as the longhorn beetles, specifically the ones that are the longhorn flower beetles, and many of the true flies are good pollinators. And then in regards to reclamation, like I say, I am not a reclamation specialist. And so I looked up to see what the BLM states reclamation should be. And, part of it is the, I grabbed this one sentence from their statement. It's the ultimate objective of reclamation is ecosystem restoration. So an ecosystem is the entire thing, whether it's the plants and all the animals that are, that live there naturally. And so restoring those habitats, specifically wildlife habitats, because insects are part of the wildlife, from surface disturbances caused by mining or construction or those types of things, it sounds simple, but it could be complex depending on the amount of disturbance. So in this picture kind of illustrates, if we had the ability to irrigate and plant, like in production agriculture, it'd be pretty simple. You could just, plant a field like this of alfalfa, which is a wildlife magnet, and you'd be done. But no, instead, you're probably going to be asked to restore habitats like this, say the oil pads or from oil drilling in very dry habitats, such as this is up at the AU7 ranch in I think it's in Weston County, I think right on the edge of Weston County that we worked on. So this was a dry year in 2012, and there was grasshopper outbreak on top of it. And that's, if there's anything I kind of specialize in, it's grasshopper management. And you also have to deal with keeping invasive weeds like cheatgrass that can take advantage of disturbed habitats. So this little guy, he was in the containment ring around storage tanks on the ranch, and his mom would put him there for safe keeping. So in addition, the BLM states that reclamation has to last long term. And this is also more difficult. If reclamation was just all about establishing plant cover to hold the soil from erosion, that would be more, perhaps that would be simpler. It may not, but that would not satisfy their definition of the restoration of the ecosystem. So part of it here, I think, is reclamation is successful when it is established a self-sustaining, vigorous, diverse native plant community. And that's the thing here is you have to have pollinators for your flowering plants that require insect pollination in order to have self-sustaining reclamation. And in this picture here, this is just north of Laramie a little ways. Those aren't toadflax, an invasive weed. That's actually western wildflower after 2 years of good rains that occurred at the right time. It's a biennial and flowers after the second year. So I think pollinator insects can help with long-term reclamation success in 2 ways. So one is ensuring that your flowering forbs that require insect pollination is successfully pollinated and set seed to perpetuate themselves and their pollinators. And then the other thing is the flowers provide critical resources for nectar and pollen to the insects, who a lot of times it's the larvae of those insects that are actually predators of plant feeding insects that may inhibit or damage your restoration effort. So things like these are flower longhorn beetles on yarrow, and then this is a sand wasp, a crabonid, their adult stage feeds on pollen and nectar, but they are predators of other insects. It depends on the species, whether they go after grasshoppers or caterpillars, and they provision their nests and put their egg in, which hatches on the insect that was captured, and then uses it for food source. Probably before I should go on further, I think probably with this audience, everybody knows what pollination is. Essentially it's that this is a very simplified diagram of the entomophilic flowers. That's the term of the plants that are used to use the insects. It's where the transfer of pollen produced by the anther from one plant to another. So these are, there are some plants that require cross-pollination. They are not self-fertile, and then others, they are self-fertile, but they can actually benefit from insects visiting them. They'll set more seed if they do. And so the insect then transfers that to the stigma, and germination occurs, and the germ tube goes down, and you get the successful seed formation after that. So the flowers that use animals are usually arranged so the animal, in this case, this is a green bottlefly, gets dusted by pollen when they visit. You can see here on its back. So, a lot of times, this is considered a filth fly species, but in nature, they were actually just part of the cleanup crew, and as adults are pollinators. This has been going on for a long, long time. The fossil evidence of flowering plants here on this side, angiosperms is the term for them, shows it diversifying and flourishing during the early Cretaceous period. You can see it very similar to this little buttercup and a soft light on top of it. I can never remember what the geologic timescales are. So if we look here, the Cretaceous is 146 to 65 million years ago. They even used a little flower on there. Flowering plants occurred then. So it's been going on for quite a while, but actually longer than that. In this illustration I took from an article about the Smithsonian Institution scientists. In their research, they found that there was a relationship between gymnosperms that was 62 million years before the flowering plants appeared. And so these are, they think they're relatives of Meconoptera, which are scorpion flies. So very interesting occurring in the. Now, before I should go any further, I'm using these terms kind of loosely. How many people have had entomology, intro entomology? One person. Okay. So I should do a little bit of clarification of the terms that I use. So in the class Insecta includes everything that makes an insect an insect. It has 3 body parts: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. It can have 2 or 4 wings or no wings through their lifestyle. Like a flea on a dog doesn't require wings as an adult, and then 6 legs. So that's what makes an insect an insect. And because it's the most diverse group of animals on the planet, insect orders are very important. So we place them into things that you probably all know by their common name. So things like the beetles, and then what we call true flies. So they're really in the order Diptera, means 2 wings. And so they all have these common traits. And within those orders are families. And because insects are so diverse, we often kind of lump them into families to talk about them. So that's in all insect families in idae. So like grasshoppers are all acrididae. And a grasshopper by itself, you could say, well, that's an acridid, and that would be very accurate. Where the example here is Coccinellidae, that's the lady beetles. And so that would be, they would belong to the order Coleoptera, sheath wings, and they have this hard shell-like front wing that provides protection over their body. And then the order Diptera, the 2 wings, only 1 pair of wings. So there's lots and lots. If you're an entomologist, you spend the first couple of years learning about all the rules of thumb, then the rest of your career learning about all the exceptions. So they're so diverse. But that ancient relationship between plants and pollinators is evidenced by things like specialized structures, such as this is a proboscis on a tobacco hornworm moth, unfolded. You've probably all seen on campus in the fall when all the flowers are going. These white-lined sphinx moths visiting, they kind of act like insect hummingbirds. They also have a long proboscis. So that proboscis is a flexible mouthpart that they can reach into flowers, tubular flowers. And so that's a specialized structure, long relationship with the plants. Other things, an example would be the butterfly family Apoidea. They have their front pair of feet have been modified into what are called brush feet that they can use to taste test flowers that they land on. You can see here, this is nectaring. So these are 4 functional legs, and then the brush feet are up here in front of its face when it's not used. So long history of these things. There's even insect plant dependency. They're totally dependent on one pollinator. So this makes them each more vulnerable to extinction. If you have some sort of event that wipes out one or the other, you're going to lose both. So the yucca moth is an example of that. The yucca moth is the only pollinator for yucca plants. Other insects will visit yucca flowers, but they're not pollinating. In return, the seed pod, you've probably all seen the seed pods on the yucca stalks. Almost every one of those will have the caterpillar of a yucca moth feeding on those developing seeds. They don't eat all of them, but they eat some of them. And it's quite remarkable, that long-term relationship. Another one that's interesting, it's a behavior. So it's called buzz or sonic pollination. And it's interesting in that there's about 20,000 different species of flowering plants that involve flowers that only release their pollen when it's buzzed or sonicated. There's some really great YouTube videos on this, and it's also relates to, again, the specialty of the plants and the relationship to the pollinator. So things, if you like tomatoes, and everybody likes tomatoes, if they're grown in a hothouse, they're going to be pollinated by bumblebee colonies. The bumblebees are really efficient at this. So the bumblebee will visit a tomato flower, and there's no nectar there. They're gathering pollen. And you can see here the pollen on the leg of this bumblebee. So the superfamily Apoidea within the order Hymenoptera, which are bees, ants, wasps, and sawflies, there's about 3,500 species of them in North America. The honeybees, the family Apoidea is what they belong to. They're considered probably the most efficient pollinators in that they have even the hairs on their body are designed to grab pollen, and actually carries a static charge to help grab the pollen from the flowers that they visit. And they have also behaviors. Now, sometimes honeybees are not the primary pollinators of a plant. So in this case, this honeybee is cutting into the flower to get to where the nectar is and avoiding where the pollen would be. So that's where that flower probably uses a insect that has perhaps a long proboscis to do its pollination chores. Other bee families within Apoidea that are pretty common, and that would be occurring in areas of Wyoming that perhaps you'd be trying to restore, are adrenids and aphids. And aphids include cuckoos, carpenter, digger, bumble, and honeybees. And so some of these are very big families. They have a lot of diversity within them. You know, a lot of the times, you know, people don't always associate insects. You know, if you see them on a flower, you think, oh yeah, that's a pollinator, but you might not see them on the flower itself. You might see them in other areas. And one of the more common ones that you can run into literally and figuratively on bare, dirt, hard-packed roads are turret or digger bees. And so they like, that's the kind of habitat they will, the females will dig holes down into and make little side chambers and then provision those chambers with pollen. And in this case, out in my dirt driveway, I have these little, move this over here, I can't remember there, Diadasia species turret bees. So they make a little turret of dirt. And you've probably all seen them, like when you're driving on dirt roads, you know, maybe you see them flying around. And they are really tied to the flowering of the scarlet gold mallow out there. So we've had 2 really dry years, and their colony on my driveway has shrunk considerably. And it's all tied to the lack of availability of their pollen source that they prefer. We also have, besides the European honeybee, alfalfa leafcutter bees are an important species that is used in the production of alfalfa seeds, so very important commercial pollinators. And then we have some of the natives that have turned out to be really good pollinators too, such as squash and alkali bees. So within that Apoidea are subfamilies, and all the insect subfamilies in INAE. So the bumblebees are within that, and most of the bumblebees are in the genus Bombus. And wild native bees are really important to our early season flowering plants because European honeybees, they can't successfully stay airborne at temperatures lower than about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They can sometimes get around that if you have a calm, still sunny day in the early spring. You'll see European honeybees down low, often visiting like dandelions when they're the first to flower. And you know, early dandelions, they flower right at the ground level. But a lot of times, if it's too cold, European honeybees can't tolerate that. Bumblebees have adaptations for that. They're big bodied, so and then they are hairy. It helps insulate them, and they can come out and they will disconnect their flight wings from their thoracic muscles and then shiver and raise their body temperature up to a point where they can fly. And then they'll visit these early flowers, like this is a pasque flower, one of my favorite flowers coming up here in the very early spring. And so they are really necessary for our wild plants that flower early in the spring. You also have others that are very interesting to me. The adrenids are mining bees, and just recently, well, it's not real recent, in 1980, this is a species, Anthro Pueblo, was described from Utah, and they actually chew into soft sandstone to make a cavity in which to nest in. The Anthrophorinae are commonly called digger bees, so that's a subfamily within the adrenids. They are solitary, meaning they're not nesting together, but because their key habitat is like bare earth with certain soil textures, they will often have all their nests together. So that's showing here. This is bare earth, and then these little mounds or excavations where the mining bees have dug it up. We also have like the alfalfa leafcutter bee belongs to the Megachilidae, and there's about 630 species that we know of in North America. So the majority of them are natives, and we call them leafcutters because they utilize cavities but they make a little, I guess you could say, a container for the ball of pollen and nectar that they forage for, and then they lay an egg on that, and then they seal up that container. So if you see leaves that have ovals cut out of them, and then just a few circles, that's the work of leafcutter bees, because they land on their preferred plants, and they cut that leaf out, and then they go and make a little cup and provision that, and then the last step of the process is they'll cut a perfect round circle for the cap that goes on the end. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that thing is also showing up on your screen too. Yeah, so they can see it a little bit better. I don't know. It's hard to say, but the orchard and mason bees are also important, and they can utilize artificial nest structures. So that's a way you can provide a necessary habitat for them. There's a great recent PBS documentary about all the bees and pollinators that can live in a small area. It was called My Garden of 1,000 Bees. It was done this fall. A really interesting one if you get a chance to watch it. So the vast majority of Wyoming's native bee species, they actually nest in the soil. And when you think about that, that makes sense because, you know, a lot of our area in the eastern part of the state is prairie, grasslands, that before you know, European settlement had probably a pretty high fire rate. So if you nested in structures above ground in the plants, say like back east where you have a lot of say weeds or shrubs that have hollow pithy stems where they can nest in those, they would be burned. So the soil provides a stable, safe place for a lot of these insects to nest in. And that really has implications for reclamation too, about the soil, because soil texture, so the amount of sand, silt, and clay can make differences to insects. What if they can successfully nest there, the structure of it, and the amount of bare areas. So there are some of the insects that are really adapted to, say, bunch grass places where you don't have a complete turf. You have that as areas of bare ground that they can utilize. And then another one is alkalinity also matters because like the alkali bee actually utilizes those areas that have, in late summer, you'll often see them with white coating of the alkali in there. They are actually a wild bee that in Washington State, they use it very successfully for their alfalfa seed industry because compared to the alfalfa leaf cutter, they get 3 times the yield by using the alkali bees. And so they have figured out ways to actually make the habitat for alkali bees and perpetuate them in that way in order to use their pollination services on the alfalfa plants. But there are many other families within Hymenoptera that also feed on nectar and do some pollination. In this case, here's this is a sawfly visiting a bistort, and then this is a little tiny buttercup, a ranunculus, and it's got, I would say, I'm not that great on the really tiny Hymenoptera, but that's probably something in the superfamily Ichneumonoidea, and they are important for small flowers. They're also very important for controlling populations of other insects because of their life cycle. Hunting wasps are another one. This is a great picture taken by my friend and former boss, Alex Ichneumonoidea. You can see it's got pollen all over its hairy thorax. So this is a common name for these are thread-waisted wasps. So again, they hunt other insects to provision their nest for their larvae, but as a food source for the adults, they visit flowers for pollen and nectar. And again, the sand wasps do the same thing. A little bit more about all those thousands of beneficial species of Hymenoptera, or often referred to as non-stinging wasps, although the aphid in this picture would say au contraire about that. They help control the plant-feeding insect populations. And this is, they do that through their the activity is called parasitoid. So, a parasite lives at the expense of its host. Parasitoid eventually kills its host. So they will insert an egg into, in this case, an aphid, and then that egg will hatch and the larva will feed on the interior of that aphid and then get to the point it's going to pupate. And so if you see aphids on a plant and you look at them, you see others that are, say, maybe normal color and moving around, and then you see a few all puffed out and white. Inside that is a silk covering, and it's the adult or the larva of this is turning into an adult. It's pupating inside the body of its host. But many of these parasitoid wasps use flower nectar for the adult stage. Again, this is important research that Professor Randa Jabor in plant science has been looking at, how to have flowers alongside your commercial crops in order to utilize and support your native parasitoids that help control plant pests. So again, I'm not saying that all of them require nectar, but because actually there are some of them that will feed on guttation fluids, which is usually probably doesn't occur very often in Wyoming outside of irrigated areas. It's where a plant will essentially, to maintain its tonic balance, it'll start oozing out some fluid that has carbohydrates in it. Aphids and soft scale insects also, they feed on the phloem of plants and they produce honeydew, that sticky sweet stuff. If you live in the, say, the tree area of Laramie in the summertime, by the end of the summer, your car gets to looking like a glazed donut. That's covered with honeydew. So, and then there's a few of them that are actually, they're a little bit more bloodthirsty in that they'll stab either a potential host or say a soft-bodied insect, and then will drink the hemolymph that results from the wound to feed themselves. So there's so much to learn about these things. One of the more interesting ones, I'll just take a little time to talk about that, is tiny. This is the third smallest insect that we know about. It is here shown to scale with the paramecium in amoeba, single-celled organisms. This is a multi-celled organism that can fly, and it seeks out the eggs of thrips. So this is an example of a western flower thrips. As an adult, she's about 1 millimeter long. Now, she produces a pretty big egg for her size. She sticks it actually into the plant tissue. And then the female of this megaphrygma comes along and inserts her egg inside that. So she developed totally inside the egg of this particular insect. Another example of ones that you can actually get commercially for controlling, say, garden pests from some of the biological control supply places are in the genus Trichogramma. And they are mainly egg parasitoids. And this is a great illustration that Kristen Potter captured. So here's a dime. This is the egg of, say, a large manduca, like that tomato hornworm that I showed you the picture of. And from that single egg emerged 28 wasps. You can see that then they all go out seeking other eggs, how that could be an effective control for many pest species. Another one that really benefits from flowers and is beneficial to us in the order Diptera, the true flies, is tachynids. And so many times you'll see them on flowers and they're big and kind of hairy and spiky looking. And the adults feed on flower nectar and pollen for their energy source. They seek out other insects to lay their eggs on. The eggs hatch and then the maggots burrow into the host insect and eat them from the inside out, such as grasshoppers or caterpillars. Here showing 3 tachynid eggs on them. So again, another beneficial insect that benefits from having flowers. There are many flies that mimic wasp coloration for defense. So you have to look closely at them because you might think, well, that's a yellowjacker visiting that flower. So in this case, here's a flower fly, family Surfidae, visiting a gentian up in the mountains. You can see there's pollen grains on it. And it's also interesting, their larvae, for the most part, there's a few species that do feed on plant material, but most of them are headless maggots. So they don't have a head capsule or eyes. They're worm-like. And they're great predators of soft-bodied insects such as aphids. So they can scramble around on the plant using little spiky projections on their body for transportation. And then they can grab an aphid and then suck the fluid contents out of its body. There's also bee flies in the family Mobilidae. In this case, this example, the larva seeks out a grasshopper egg pod and then chews the eggs up over the course of its development and will merge out and perpetuate the species that way. You can see it has a long, stiff proboscis for feeding on flowers. There are some others. This is really common when in late summer, you'll see it like on sunflowers a lot. When I was a kid, I thought it was a cross between a mosquito and a woolly mammoth, the way it's all hairy, but it certainly, it's also beneficial and helps control the populations of, say, the root feeding larvae of June beetles. The beetles are considered mess and soil pollinators because they have chewing mouthparts. And so they will often, on the flowers that are adapted to using them, they will have kind of sacrificial parts that attract in the beetles, and in the process, they do pollination. So the flower longhorn beetles, they often have a very hairy thorax. So as they move around on the flower and chew on things and feed, and then move to the next flower, they can do pollination. And so they don't really destroy the part of the flower that develops the seed. Or in this case, here's a checkered beetle. You can see its body is very hairy, and it's it's interesting on this little flax flower. It's cut off the anthers. I don't know if it's eating the stalk in which the anther was, but very interesting. Yeah, an example that I can give you, because I know that crested wheatgrass and intermediate wheatgrass is a lot of times utilized for reclamation or just to stabilize and protect the soil. Certainly, our highway right-of-ways are widely planted with that crested wheatgrass. And in this example, here's a field up near Lusk, Wyoming. At this time of year, I think this was like around June 1st, this picture, it should have been much brighter green and taller and starting to put out seed heads. It looked bleached out. And part of the reason why it's a monoculture of crested wheatgrass, which is great for like excluding, say, cheatgrass, but it set itself up for an infestation of a native insect that was able to take advantage of this monoculture and probably leave behind its predators and parasitoids. So this is a black grass bug, Lababs hesperus. You can see here, it's a little true bug. They have a piercing sucking mouth part. And instead of chewing on the leaves, they just suck the cell content out. So they've sucked all the, I guess you could say, the goodness out of it. They remove so much of the nutrient content that if you had animals grazing on this, it's pretty much down to cellulose and lignin that's left behind. Not really nutritious. And so in this case, their populations can explode. They've actually have the ability to kill CRP and crested wheatgrass fields. They've been documented to do that in western Nebraska because they feed on it so heavily. Their populations get so thick. On native rangeland, you pick it up in sweep nets, but it's at low population levels. So I think, I don't have the proof. I'd love to do a study on it, but I think it's all due to this monoculture. They've left it behind because they're not very mobile insects. The females are what's referred to as precipitous. And so they have short wings and can't fly very well. The males are a little bit more mobile. So the alternative here is to chemical control. You can utilize a synthetic insecticide. If you apply it correctly, you can get good control, and usually it protects the field for several years because, like say, they're slow to move back into it. So their biology is such, the crested wheatgrass and intermediate wheatgrass greens up pretty early in the spring. And so they are also timed to that. They'll start to be active very early in the spring, and then will complete their life cycle and mate and start laying eggs in like May. And where they put their eggs is in the stems of the previous year's growth. So like say, there are ways, mowing, burning, even haying can help reduce their populations if they get too bad. But again, kind of interesting. But I think it's all because they've left behind the native predators and parasitoids that might attack them. And that's probably due to that habitat not being satisfactory for things like parasitoid wasps. Now, I've kind of whipped through this presentation pretty fast, and I didn't know if they would have any questions, whether throughout it or afterwards, but I would be happy to try to answer any that you have. I've also, there is a publication out there, I don't know how applicable it would be for restoration, but the pollinators, promoting pollinators on your place talks about some of the habitats and actually things that you can do. In some cases, it's not even really about, when you're looking at the scale of a garden or a yard, it's about leaving a habitat for your beneficial insects, such as the parasitoid wasps, those types of things. So, it also includes information on non-insect pollinators, and then also has, if you're interested in honeybees, it has information on getting into and starting honeybees. So, do we have any questions? Yes.
So on your crested wheatgrass field, is there a general rule of thumb of a ratio that you would want to plant flowered plants to cut back on those black flies, and would that make a big difference?
Well, that's a good question, because like I use the acronym CRP, which is Conservation Reserve Program. I don't know if anybody has heard of that. So this was a program that started back in the 80s to try to reduce the amount of essentially wheat or other small grains, and I think it was mainly wheat at the start, and remove erodible lands from production. So the farmers got paid to put that land out of production, and part of it was to establish grasses and forbs. They wanted a mixture on there. Initially, they tried to encourage people to go back to like native grasses, but they soon ran out of seed. There just wasn't the seed to support that. So they started using crested wheatgrass and intermediate wheatgrass mixed with other plants such as clovers in wetter areas, those types of things. And so the goal of the USDA program was to try to restore to production productive habitat and have flowering plants be a part of it. Unfortunately, a lot of the flowering plants die out. It's not sustainable for some reason. And so in some cases, those fields, but their initial goal, and so I would say that there'd probably be information created by the USDA scientists about the proper mixtures to try to have sustainability. Because one of the other things about the flowering plants that they were recommending were their legumes. So they help rejuvenate soil with nitrogen through the nitrogen fixation. I don't know, to try to interplant within a monoculture like this, what would be a proper one, whether something like flax might be able to be interseeded and be successful and sustain it. Again, it's really hard to mimic the native prairie. It's because in many cases, say like that one image that I showed of the western wallflower, a lot of years you don't even know it's out there. There might be maybe there's a low spot where it caught enough snow moisture or rain, and you have a few of the plants. But that one year, it was just, there was western wallflower all over the place. And so it's really hard to come up with that, and then also to buy the seeds probably, and then getting them established. So definitely, it's not easy. I didn't say it'd be easy to do that, but that would be beneficial. And I think in this case, it would really benefit those types of, in this case, this was a pasture, but it was no longer really worth that much for grazing because of the damage it was sustaining.
The reason I asked that is because I ran into that. There are a few areas in Sweetwater County that they had me put crested grass when we reseeded. And first year it came up, it was pretty good in the second year.
Oh, yeah.
And they were decent years. I mean, it wasn't during a drought, we had moisture, but then just by the second year, they were.
Yeah, if you go out in those fields, they leave evidence of feeding on the leaves, but during the day, a lot of times they're sheltering in the crowns and in the cracks of the soil. You don't hardly see it. And then when they're initially during the green up, they're tiny. I mean, the Labops hesperus is maybe about a quarter inch long as an adult, and they're quite mobile. The best time we found to actually sample them was at the end of the day in the twilight. They'll come out because the soil is at its maximum temperature then. And so there's that boundary layer down there, and they'll be active and out feeding. You can pick them up with the sweep nets to get an idea of their population density. And if you're adjacent, say, if you have a reclamation area next to, say, a highway right away where you have spillover of these things into it, yeah, they can rapidly move into a new planting, and that would be much more vulnerable, more likely to kill it. Have a question?
So a monoculture like this that's suffering from an infestation, would you have to deal with the infestation before overseeding or introducing new species, or would the new vegetation species that you introduce, would they also suffer if there's an active infestation?
On Labops, they're exclusively grass feeders. They have a broad host range on the grasses and feed on a lot of different ones. They only utilize some of the ones that have a fairly large hollow stem in which the females insert their eggs. But they would not be a danger to broadleaf plant being planted into it. So you probably wouldn't have to do any kind of a treatment to rid the grasses of that. And it might even actually, when you think about it, it might even help you establish the fords initially, because there'd be less competition with that grass monoculture.
Yeah, so for land quality purposes, for reclamation on mining activity, we require quite a mix of shrubs and forbs and grasses to be utilized. So I was wondering on something like this, if, like you're saying, you could introduce the shrubs and the forbs, those could get going. Probably not a good idea to introduce more grass species.
No, probably not. It would be difficult. That's one of the things about the crested and intermediate wheatgrass is it can actually compete with like the invasive winter annuals like cheatgrass, and of course, we now have ventinata and medusated in the state too.
That's always the challenge, is to choke out the cheatgrass as quick as possible.
Yeah, so you can utilize it for that, and then the other thing that can be good about those grasses is they'll catch and hold snow, which can really aid in some of the other plants getting established initially. And of course, also the protection from the wind erosion. So there's I think a real reason to continue using them, but definitely I think it's one of the interesting examples where many times our pests are introduced pests, and they come without their parasitoids and predators and disease, and then their population explodes. Well, in this case, this is an introduced grass, and then we have a native that's like, oh, this is perfect habitat. It explodes. Yes, Christine.
To turn that on its head, because clearly if you've got a production field, that's a problem. I know that along our highways in Wyoming, there are a lot of crested plantings, and since crested wheatgrass is introduced, it's no longer considered so desirable. Have you ever tried or seen if you can move these native insects to those sites to maybe knock back some of those plantings so that folks that are now trying to manage the roadsides for natural or native species can kind of begin to tip the balance in their favor?
Yeah, that's the problem with a lot of these things, is that there's really no source of those on a large enough scale. Perhaps you have to, yeah, you have to, it's like a well drilled pad is probably going to be more rapidly recolonized by the natives than, say, an assembly yard for a wind farm or something like that that's huge. And the other thing about it, you got to hope. It's kind of like the Field of Dreams, where if we build it, they will come. If you can provide them with that, then the insects are there. A lot of them can find stuff, but it might take several years before you get it reestablished to the point. But again, if you lack those those flowering plants, you'll never get them back. So that I guess that would be my case. Is the best we can hope for is to then I suppose on a really big area, you could maybe try to do some sweep netting in a native habitat and bring them in and do release once you got some native plants established for them.
But just like seed catalogs don't have all native species, there are no insect catalogs to bring things in other than what ladybugs, right?
Yeah, even things, like, what I visit a lot is Arbicola Organics, and they have stuff that, it's very expensive to do it on a large scale. And you also have the issue of providing everything that they need. And again, one of the things about a lot of our insects, they utilize the soil. And so the disruption to the soil on a large scale might prevent some things from recolonizing. The soil texture or structure just might not be right. Like I say, grasshoppers, my area of interest in. A long time ago, I read an article, a publication by a scientist named Idae down in Texas, and he was studying a oligophagous grasshopper species. And oligophagous is one that is really restricted in its diet. It only has like maybe 2 or 3 host plants. And in this case, he found an area of the host plant, but the soil type, it was really heavy clay soil. He didn't find any of that grasshopper. So the grasshopper was not able to utilize that soil for its egg pods. Most grasshoppers, they lay their eggs in that top layer of the soil. And it was totally unsuited, I guess, for the grasshoppers. And, it was such a striking thing because, you had perfect habitat in one respect, but it lacked that key of soil, and probably soil texture was the thing. It's been widely known that a lot of times grasshoppers, their hatching and survival of the eggs and egg pods is enhanced by soils with more sand in them, so, rather than heavy clay soils.
Any other questions? Thanks so much, Scott.
You're welcome.
Before everybody goes, I've got something to hand out if you're in the class. For our guests, you're welcome to hang out and talk with our speaker.
There's stuff that Tristan.
No, that's okay. For this class, usually it's a combination of versus also Ichneumonoidea. Yes, it is. So no worries.
Can I get a direction for Juliana?
She was with the Larry Rivers Conservation.
Is he gonna be online?
I believe I will put some of the figures online, but I'm gonna wait and see before I post the entire thing. So it's good that you can write online. Okay.
Yes.
We got one, right?
Yeah.
So there are questions.
Like put this in a Word document.
Yeah. What I'll do is I'm normally post the figures. And I put them in the Word document. And write your answers around them and just number them as you go. So that should be
But
fine.
submit it online.
Yeah, but it will be under exam 1 and the modules online. Okay, thank you. All right.
Oh, yeah. Let's go pick up horns.
Oh, it's pretty nice out for that.
Beautiful, you gotta get to it before the rain starts.
Anybody yet to find out really why it's there or what's going on with it?